The entire dining hall fell silent when the boy's cry broke through the sound of clinking silverware. Conversations quieted, eyes turned subtly, the kind of curious attention that always carries judgment. Waitress Laura Ellison approached with steady steps, trying to disguise the rush in her chest. She knelt beside the boy, who hid his face in his hands. "Hey, it's okay. Breathe, slowly." Her voice came out soft, almost like a song. The billionaire's son, Samuel Grayson, had a red face, tearful eyes, and a trembling chin as he tried not to sob. Beside him sat his father, Richard Grayson, CEO of one of the largest corporations in the country, caught somewhere between discomfort and impatience. "Samuel, please." "We're in public," the man said, lowering his tone, but not enough to hide his irritation. "We've already talked about behavior." Laura looked up at him. For a second, she forgot the uniform and the rules of service. "Excuse me, sir," she said, without arrogance, only calm. "He doesn't need scolding. He just needs a mother." The silence that followed was absolute. No glass, no fork, no sound dared cross that sentence. The man blinked, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. And right then, something inside him began to crack, slowly, but in a way he would feel for a long time. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any life stories that could be mine, or yours. That day was typical at Maison Vert, a full house, waiters gliding through the hall with fine wines and elegant dishes, serving a carefully selected clientele, some in business meetings, others simply enjoying a fine meal. Maison Vert, known for its sophistication and steep prices, was the kind of place where every gesture felt choreographed. Richard Grayson had arrived with 3 executives, investment partners, men who measured respect in numbers. By his side walked Samuel, his 8-year-old son, wearing a small gray suit that made him look like a tired adult. Richard rarely brought him to meetings, but that night he had no choice. The nanny hadn't shown up, and the dinner was too important to cancel. He believed the boy would learn by observing. What he didn't realize was that Samuel would learn, but something entirely different. Laura Ellison, the waitress, watched from afar. She had been on her evening shift for 7 hours, with 2 more to go. The whole restaurant functioned like an orchestra, waiters exchanging precise glances, plates circulating like relics, the chef barking quiet orders. Nothing escaped the pattern, until that table entered the room. She noticed the boy first. It wasn't hard. While the adult spoke in figures, he spun his straw in the glass, making bubbles, restless. It wasn't rebellion, it was loneliness disguised. Laura knew that kind of boredom well, the kind that comes from not belonging to the conversation nor to the world around you. The order was placed, and dinner went on. The men's laughter came in calculated waves. Samuel tried to speak, but his father silenced him with a subtle gesture. "Later, son." The kind of later that never comes. Minutes later, Laura returned to the table. She noticed the boy pushing his plate away. She approached. "Didn't like it, sweetheart?" Samuel shrugged. "I just want to go home," he said sadly. The father lifted his eyes from his phone. "Eat, Samuel. We've talked about this." Laura stepped back, but something in her resisted. The boy lifted his fork reluctantly, then set it down again. The executives went on discussing contracts, mergers, and targets. The billionaire seemed perfectly at ease in his role, the man who commands, the man who doesn't listen. And then, as in every story that turns on a small moment, something trivial began to grow. The boy knocked over his glass of juice. The liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a living stain. Startled, he tried to wipe it with a napkin. The billionaire reacted with the reflex of restrained anger, a hard look, the kind that says more than 1,000 words. "I can't believe you did that, Samuel." The table went silent. The boy froze, eyes filling again, lips trembling. Samuel began to cry, quietly, trying not to ruin the adult's atmosphere. Laura, watching from afar, didn't think. She just moved. She grabbed some napkins and knelt beside him. "It's okay," she said gently. "It happens to everyone." Samuel shook his head, tears streaming down his face, and the sweat of someone trying hard to hold it in. "He's going to be mad." She looked at the man seated in front of them, the boy's father, who watched her, surprised by the audacity of a woman in a simple apron meddling where she hadn't been invited. But Laura didn't back down. "He's just a child, Mr. Grayson. They remind us every day that dinner isn't the most important thing." The words weren't meant to wound, but they hit deep. The man took a slow breath and looked away. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. Samuel looked at her with the honesty only a child can have when they recognize someone speaking the truth. And that's when, for the first time that night, Richard seemed to actually see his son. What he saw unsettled him, a tired boy, trying to behave like an adult when all he really needed was a hug. Laura saw it too. And in that moment, seeing the boy shrink in embarrassment, cheeks flushed red, she whispered the phrase that would cut through that table like a simple, devastating revelation. "He just needs a mother." Those words echoed louder than any crystal toast. Richard Grayson, the man who had built an empire on control and calculation, felt something that couldn't fit into any spreadsheet, a discomfort made of shame, longing, and something close to regret. Laura stood up, picked up the glass, straightened the tablecloth, and slowly walked away, leaving behind a silence no one could fill. The executives resumed their conversation with trembling voices, pretending everything was normal. But dinner was already over, even if no one had said it aloud. Outside, the driver opened the car door. Samuel climbed in first, head down. Richard hesitated for a moment before following. He looked through the restaurant window one last time. The waitress was there, her back turned, adjusting tables, doing her job like someone who doesn't expect to be remembered. He looked away and got into the car. But no matter how hard he tried, the sentence wouldn't leave his head. "He just needs a mother." It was simple. It was true. And it was everything he didn't know how to give. If you believe life always finds a way to remind us of what we've forgotten, write in the comments, "Destiny." In the days that followed, Samuel withdrew. He barely spoke, refused food, and slept clutching a small teddy bear, the same one placed in his arms the day he was born. Richard watched him from a distance, trying to read his son's silence, searching for any sign that could help him understand what was happening. The boy wasn't just sad, he seemed distant, trapped somewhere even his father couldn't reach. One night, Richard heard him whispering in the dark. "She was kind to me." It took the businessman a moment to realize what he meant. His chest tightened. It was about the waitress, Laura. The way she had spoken to the boy, her tone, the calm he himself never managed to use. Samuel soon fell asleep, but Richard stayed awake. The sentence echoed in his mind like a cruel reminder of something he could never give. The next morning dawned gray over the city. The wall clock showed almost 7 when Richard came downstairs, his jacket slung over his shoulders. Breakfast was set, black coffee, toast, sliced fruit, but Samuel hadn't come down. The housekeeper explained softly that he'd said he wasn't hungry. Richard nodded without replying. He climbed slowly to the boys' room. The door was half open. Inside, he heard the faint sound of a pencil scratching paper. Samuel was drawing in the corner of the bed, focused, as if that act was his way of staying quiet. The father approached. "What are you drawing?" he asked. The boy hesitated before answering. "The lady from the restaurant." Richard froze. "The lady?" Samuel looked up, uncertain. "The waitress. She was nice to me. Nobody talks to me like that." The man took a deep breath. It was a simple comment from a child, but it hit like a blow. For years, he had convinced himself that he could give his son everything money could buy, expensive schools, toys, trips. But now, staring at that small drawing of a smiling woman, he realized what money could never buy: affection. Richard's wife, Helena, had died in childbirth. For a long time, the businessman hid behind his work. He built a routine that left no room for feeling. He turned guilt into productivity. He told himself that success would be the legacy he left his son. But success doesn't fill empty rooms, and Samuel's silence was beginning to collect an old debt. In his home office, Richard opened a folder full of contracts and reports. He tried to focus on the numbers, the next day's meetings, the million-dollar projects. But his gaze kept drifting back toward his son's bedroom door. He closed the folder. For the first time in years, he couldn't work. That afternoon, Samuel sat on the porch, watching the rain fall over the garden. As Richard passed by, he stopped behind him. "It's cold. Come inside, son." The boy didn't move. "When Mom died, did you cry?" he asked suddenly, without looking at his father. The question hung in the air, suspended between the sound of rain and Richard's own heartbeat. He hesitated. He had never spoken about it with the boy. Not with anyone. "I cried," he finally said. "I just didn't know what to do afterward." Samuel looked at him for the first time that day. "Me neither." Richard moved closer and sat beside him under the porch. They stayed there, silent, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. It was the closest they had been in months, two lonely souls sharing the same silence. The next morning, the driver waited in the garage. The car was ready, the clock was pressing, but Richard didn't get in. "Not today, Andrew," he said. He went to his son's room and waited for him to wake. Samuel opened his eyes slowly and looked confused to see his father there. "You're not going to work?" Richard shook his head. "Not today. I thought we could do something together." The boy frowned, suspicious. "Like what?" "Anything," he replied. "Whatever you want." Samuel thought for a moment. "Can I really choose?" "You can." The boy hesitated, then smiled for the first time in days. "Then I want to go there." "Where?" "The restaurant. I want to see the lady." Richard froze for a second. "Laura." The name crossed his mind like a reminder of what he'd been trying to ignore since that night, the woman who had dared to say what no one ever had. He took a deep breath and nodded. "All right. We'll go to the restaurant." The Elysium was almost empty at that hour. Laura was serving a table in the corner when she saw them come in. The surprise showed on her face, but she kept her professionalism. Samuel ran to her and hugged her, spontaneous, sincere. "Hi, Laura." She laughed, a bit shy. "Hey, little one. It's so good to see you." Richard stood a few steps behind, watching the scene. There was something uncomfortable in realizing that his son smiled more easily at a stranger than at him. Yet, at the same time, that smile brought him a strange sense of peace. Laura looked at him and nodded respectfully. "Mr. Grayson." He replied with a slight nod. "We came to thank you." She frowned, confused. "Thank me?" "For treating my son with kindness and care," he said simply. Laura smiled, a gentle smile that dissolved the tension. "I love children. And he's adorable." For a moment, no one said a word. The faint clinking of silverware filled the air. Samuel held her hand and pointed to a drawing he'd folded and kept in his pocket. "I made this for you." Laura unfolded the paper. It was a portrait of her, the crooked smile, the apron, and beneath it, a small caption written in uneven letters, "The lady who was kind to me." She knelt down to meet his eyes. "Can I keep it?" "You can." Richard watched in silence, and for the first time, he felt something different, an old desire to try again. When they left, Samuel walked beside his father, holding his hand tightly. The businessman looked at his son and realized that perhaps this was the first time they were truly walking together, and not just side by side. Days later, destiny moved again, quietly, like someone who prefers to work behind the scenes. Richard Grayson had been invited to visit a children's inclusion project, an initiative his company had sponsored for years but that he had never personally visited. The car stopped in front of a modest building painted in bright colors. On the facade, large letters read, Casa Horizonte, Children's Support Center. Children ran through the courtyard with paintbrushes in their hands, clothes splattered with colors, laughter blending with distant children's music. Samuel jumped out first, drawn by the lively scene. Richard followed, adjusting his watch, still wrapped in his expensive suit and the unease of a man who doesn't quite know how to move in a place so full of freedom. "Dad," the boy called, pointing ahead. "Look." It's her. Richard looked up. There she was, Laura Ellison, in a light blue apron, her hair tied up in a loose bun, helping two children paint a mural. She was laughing, and the sound of that laughter drifted across the yard with a softness he couldn't remember hearing before. Samuel ran toward her, shoes tapping the floor, face glowing. "Laura!" She turned, surprised, and for an instant time seemed to pause. "Samuel!" she exclaimed, kneeling to hug him. "It's so good to see you, little one." The hug was spontaneous, natural, as if they had known each other far longer than they actually had. Richard watched from a distance, feeling an uneasy mix of pride and discomfort. There was something disarming about Laura, an effortless sincerity, a kind of presence that made the rest of the world seem unnecessary. When she stood up, their eyes met. "Mr. Grayson," she said with a respectful smile. "What a coincidence!" "Or destiny," he replied, without thinking. Laura smiled but said nothing, turning back to the children, wiping paint from one child's hands. Samuel stayed beside her, helping with the brushes, and for the first time he truly seemed to belong somewhere. Richard watched quietly. It had been years since he'd seen his son so at ease. And there was something familiar in the way Laura leaned down to listen to the children, the patience, the tone of voice that mixed firmness with warmth. Later, as the event wound down and the children began cleaning up, Richard approached. Laura was alone, gathering paintbrushes and jars. "I didn't know you worked here," he said, trying to sound casual. "I've been working here for about 2 years," she replied. "I started as a volunteer, then I just stayed. It's the kind of place that reminds you who you can still be." Samuel liked being here. "He hardly ever joins in on anything," Richard said. "He's a good boy," Laura answered. "He just needs space to feel, without fear." The words sounded simple, but Richard felt in them a truth that was hard to face. She looked at him for a moment, as if studying him beyond the suit and the titles. "May I ask you something, Mr. Grayson?" "Of course." "His mother—" She hesitated. "She passed away, didn't she?" Richard nodded slowly. "During childbirth." Laura's expression softened. "Her name was Helena, wasn't it?" The man froze. "Yes," he said, almost in a whisper. "How do you know?" Laura lowered her eyes, fidgeting with the paint jars. "I knew her." It took Richard several seconds to process what he'd just heard. "What do you mean, you knew her?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "We grew up in the same neighborhood. We went to school together. She was my best friend when we were young." She paused, as if crossing a painful memory. "We dreamed of opening a little coffee shop someday, small, full of books on the shelves and the smell of cake in the air. But life took us down different roads." He stared at her, speechless. Laura went on, her voice low but steady. "When she got married, she drifted away a bit. She was happy. She talked about you with a light in her eyes I've only seen once in my life." She paused, struggling to hold back emotion. "Then one day, I read in the paper about the childbirth." The silence that followed was dense, almost tangible. Richard felt something stir inside him, a mix of shock and guilt. "I had no idea," he murmured. "She never mentioned any close friends." The memory cut deep. Richard looked away, feeling the weight of his own choices. "And I failed her in that," he finally said. "I was so trapped in what I lost that I forgot what I still had." Laura looked at him, her eyes full of compassion, not pity, but understanding. "Pain changes us, Mr. Grayson. It just doesn't have to decide who we become." He nodded, unable to speak. In the distance, Samuel laughed, painting what was left of the mural, a big yellow sun, far too large for the space it had. In the car, on the way home, Samuel fell asleep with his head resting on his father's shoulder. Richard looked at his son, and for the first time, he didn't see what was missing. He saw what could still be saved. The memory of Helena and the face of Laura blurred together in his mind, past and present stitched by the same invisible thread. Outside, the city lights began to glow. Richard took a deep breath, feeling that something inside him was finally moving. He didn't know what to call it yet, but maybe it was hope. The next day, The boy developed a sudden fever. Samuel was quieter than usual, his face flushed, his eyes distant. Richard noticed when his son refused dinner, something rare. He called the family doctor, who arrived quickly, examined the boy, and said with the rehearsed calm of someone who'd seen everything, "There's no sign of infection. It's probably just a mild virus, or fatigue." Richard nodded, but something inside him refused to rest. The boy burned, sweating and trembling. Even in sleep, he kept calling out a name that hurt to hear. Laura. The next morning, the fever persisted. The thermometer read nearly 40 degrees. The doctor returned, ran new tests, but nothing explained it. No cough, no pain, no symptom that fit any diagnosis. Richard stood by the bedroom door, hands in his pockets, watching his son struggle to breathe. The large, silent room felt too cold, full of everything except what mattered. That's when he remembered her words. "He just needs a mother." The phrase echoed like both a reminder and an invitation. Richard glanced at his watch, hesitated. Then, for the first time in a long while, he followed instinct instead of logic. He picked up the phone and searched for the number he had saved, without really knowing why. "Laura, I'm sorry to call at this hour. It's Samuel. He's had a fever for 2 days, and the doctor doesn't know what it is. He just keeps calling for you." On the other end, silence. Then her voice, calm, almost a whisper. "Give me the address. I'm coming." The Grayson mansion had never felt so vast as it did that night. When Laura arrived, the grand hall seemed to echo her every step. Richard was waiting near the stairs, without his suit, his face drawn and weary. "Thank you for coming," he said, with a sincerity that needed no formalities. "Where is he?" she asked. Richard led her upstairs to the bedroom. Samuel slept restlessly, sheets clinging to his skin. His face burned with fever, yet his body trembled from the cold. Laura set her bag on a chair and approached the bed. "Hey, little one," she said, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "It's me, Laura." Samuel opened his eyes slowly. A faint smile appeared, but it was enough. "I knew you'd come," he murmured. And as if that were all he needed, his eyes closed again. Richard looked away, as though the scene revealed too much. Laura took a towel, soaked it in cool water, and began changing the compresses. "He's dehydrated," she said. "He needs to drink small amounts of liquid." "The doctor's tried everything," Richard replied. "He says it's emotional." Laura lifted her eyes. "Sometimes what has no name isn't an illness. It's absence." The businessman said nothing. Laura sat beside the bed and began to hum softly, a melody without words, just sound, something between comfort and memory. The boy drifted into sleep, his breathing easing. Richard stood motionless by the door, watching. That woman, who not long ago had been serving tables and now filled a lifeless house with presence, had a strength he couldn't understand. And for the first time, he wanted to. Hours passed. Laura stayed there, alternating between fresh compresses and quiet stories. When dawn arrived, the thermometer read 37.5. She exhaled in relief. Richard brought her a cup of tea. "Thought you might need this too," he said, handing it to her. She smiled. "Thank you." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a different kind, the kind born when two people learn to listen to each other without words. "Does he always sleep like this?" Laura asked, glancing at the boy. "No," Richard replied. "Actually, he never sleeps peacefully." She looked at him for a moment. "Maybe now he will." He looked away, a faint smile crossing his lips. "You talk as if you could change the world." "Not the world," she said. "But sometimes one night is enough." Later, in the kitchen, she prepared another pot of tea. The mansion, once cold, looked different under the soft yellow light. Richard leaned against the counter, watching her stir the teapot as if it were a familiar, rehearsed gesture. "I never imagined seeing you here," he said, with a faint smile. "Neither did I," Laura replied. "Places like this don't usually have room for people like me." People like you. People who say what they feel. Who still believe things can be fixed. Richard stayed silent, but there was truth in her words. Laura looked at him seriously and added, Samuel doesn't need luxury, Mr. Grayson. He needs presence. He took a deep breath. You can call me Richard. She hesitated, then nodded. All right, Richard. The clock was nearing 5 when Samuel woke, his eyes brighter, his face cool again. Laura, you stayed. She smiled. Of course I did. Richard stepped closer, relief softening his expression as he ran his hand through his son's hair. Samuel looked at his father, then at Laura. Now I can really sleep. The businessman and the woman exchanged a silent look. It was the kind of moment that needs no explanation, the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but that destiny seemed determined to weave. Outside, the sun was starting to rise. Richard leaned against the wall, exhausted yet grateful. Laura adjusted the blankets, and for a second their fingers brushed. No words, just a suspended moment, filled with something new and inevitable. And as daylight broke, the businessman finally understood, there are things money can never buy. And some of them, sometimes, walk through the door unannounced, bringing tea, care, and a silence that heals. The sun had not yet conquered the fog when Laura finished straightening the sheets. Samuel slept peacefully, his breathing steady, his face free from any trace of the fever that had turned the house into a silent hospital only hours before. She watched him for a moment, with that kind of care that can't be taught, only born. Then she gathered the towels and the basin of cool water, stacked everything on the tray, and turned to leave. Richard stood by the door, shirt wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. He looked as though he had spent the entire night there, unable to rest while his son burned with fever. He's going to be fine, Laura said with a brief smile. He just needs rest. I know, he replied, his voice low and rough. Thanks to you. She shook her head. It was nothing. She started to leave, but he took a hesitant step forward. Are you going back to work? Yes, she replied. My shift starts at 10. If I hurry, I can still make it. Richard looked at his sleeping son. The room was calm, but the thought of waking up and not seeing her there unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. But what about when Samuel wakes up? He asked, almost without thinking. Laura looked at him, surprised. The question carried more weight than it seemed. He'll understand, she said simply. Children adapt. Richard looked down at the floor, as if searching for courage in his reflection. Then I don't want him to have to adapt again. She frowned, confused. What do you mean? I mean, don't go back to the restaurant. Stay here. Work with me. Laura let out a short, incredulous laugh. Work here? But what would I even do in a house like this? Richard ran a hand through his hair, trying to collect his thoughts. You could help with Samuel. His schoolwork, meals, keeping the house alive. That has another name, she replied, arching an eyebrow. A governess. Or nanny, he added with an awkward smile. Choose whichever title you like. Laura hesitated. The impulse was to say no, out of pride, prudence, fear. But Richard's tired, honest eyes dismantled any defense she had left. All right, she said at last. But only until he's better. Richard nodded. Deal. But both of them knew, even if they didn't admit it, that this until had no date set. The following days were different. The cold silence of the mansion gave way to forgotten sounds, a child's laughter, the smell of cake, hurried footsteps down the hall. Laura brought life into every corner of that house. Samuel recovered quickly. He spent mornings studying by her side, as she turned homework into an adventure. Sometimes Richard would watch them from afar, unnoticed, and find himself smiling for no reason. At night, they ate dinner together. Laura told simple stories, the kind that mixed humor with memory. Samuel listened, enchanted. Richard listened, silently. One afternoon, while the boy was drawing in the living room, Laura appeared carrying a pile of folded clothes. The maid did the basics, but his closet was a mess, she said. I never noticed. Richard gave a half-smile. I guess I've always expected things to fix themselves. No house fixes itself, Richard. She looked at him. And neither does a person. He wanted to respond, but her gaze disarmed him. Over time, the days grew lighter. Laura and Samuel started a small garden behind the house. They planted flowers, then mint, then tomatoes. Richard pretended not to care, but he always passed by in the late afternoon, just to see. "You're not very good at pretending," Laura said one day, laughing. "I'm terrible at it," he admitted. "Especially when I want to be near you." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Laura pretended not to notice, but her heart did. On a rainy night, weeks later, Samuel was already asleep. Laura was in the kitchen, preparing tea. The rain struck the windows hard, the sound filling the empty space between words. Richard walked in, no suit, shirt sleeves rolled up. "I can't sleep," he said. "Tea helps. Only if it's yours." She smiled and poured 2 cups. They sat at the table, facing each other. For a while, they just listened to the rain. "You know, Richard," she began softly, "I think I should leave." He looked up, surprised. "Leave? Why?" "Because I'm mixing things up. The job, the house, you." She took a deep breath. "I don't know where duty ends and what I feel begins." Richard said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because any word would have been too small. She stood and walked to the window. "I came here to take care of your son. And now, I don't know if I'm taking care of him or myself." Then he stepped closer, slowly. "Laura," he said, voice steady but low, "I don't want you to leave." She turned. "Why not?" "Because I don't know what this house would be without you." He took a deep breath. "And neither would I." Laura tried to hold back her tears but couldn't. "Richard, don't say that." "I have to." He took another step forward. "I want you to stay. Not as an employee. Not as someone passing through. I want you to stay as a mother to Samuel, and as my wife." Time stopped for a moment. She looked at him, unsure whether to believe it. "Do you know what you're saying?" "For the first time, I do." His voice carried no haste, no doubt, only truth. Laura wiped her tears with the back of her hand, laughing softly through the sobs. "I wasn't expecting this." "Neither was I," Richard smiled. "But sometimes, what we don't expect is exactly what's been missing." The next morning, Samuel walked into the kitchen and found them together. She was making coffee, he was reading the newspaper, smiling. "You stayed," the boy said, hugging Laura tightly. Richard laughed. "I tried to send her away, but she doesn't listen to me." Samuel looked from his father to Laura and said, with a child's simple wisdom, "Good thing." Laura hugged him hard. Richard watched, and in that moment he understood that home wasn't the house, the name, or the fortune. It was that instant. 3 people. A new beginning. And the feeling that, finally, everything was exactly where it was meant to be. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional life stories, and leave a like if this one touched your heart.